So today we're going to do a little bit of a review, and as always, we want to go, I always swore I had a, okay, all right, there we go. We're going to review the geographic perspective again. How could I ever begin a class without that, because it's so important here. A little bit about cultural change. That'll be a review. Talk a little bit about the HIspano Homeland. By now you should have a lot of those concepts well in your mind. Talk somewhat about the development of the dire economic conditions that occurred there, the good years and then the bad years, and those made for difficult times. A little bit about the persistence of the Hispanos in their homeland during the Great Depression, and then their great out-migration and some recent trends. So remember our definition of geography. Geography is a broadly applicable interdisciplinary perspective that allows us to observe and analyze anything that's distributed across space. We are looking interdisciplinary. We're looking at environmental aspects, cultural aspects, and so forth. We first identify spatial distributions, and there we have looked at the spatial distribution of the Hispano Homeland. And we've also noted how that distribution, as being different from the California and Tejano homelands, really contributed to the isolation that was going to be necessary. We've investigated the underlying spatial processes. Why did the Hispano homeland stay so isolated? And primarily because it didn't have any economic pull factors to bring Anglos and outsiders in to diffuse outside cultures. And then today we'll be thinking a little bit about our spatial predictions about what can happen with the homeland. Is it gone forever? Does it only live in the minds of people on the pages of books and libraries? Or is there something still there? And although we're not using the geospatial technologies much in here, that's what a real geographical scientist would do, would incorporate those technologies to improve geography. Remember that all cultural change is due to innovation, invention, or spatial diffusion. The Hispano homeland, the people moved into the homeland with their culture, and then in the absence of outside spatial diffusion, to change that culture, they very much underwent minimal cultural change, which allowed them to become the archaic folk culture that we know them today. The barriers were economic and environmental, and we can think about the concepts of homeland again. Remember, we've got people, in this case, the people who think of themselves as the Hispanos, the place or the territory that is northern New Mexico and the Pecos and the Rio Grande rivers. And those people having their sense of home, of bonding with that. And if you get to talking to the people out there, you really realize that they feel that is their special place. They're supposed to be there. They feel rooted in that, almost that it was at the will of a superhuman deity, if you will. And the control of place. Oftentimes there have been conflict and fights within the groups, but they themselves, as a whole, try to protect their village and their culture from outside. And then the time, realizing that the Hispano homeland itself began in the late 1500s. By the late 1700s, the Rio Grande portion had become overpopulated, and so we began to see people moving into the Pecos region. So this distribution, most isolated area, least change, nobody was really coming through that area in any large numbers. When the railroad came in the 1880s, that did sort of open up some transitions, but down the little villages, the Pecos, that really didn't happen that much. So set up and look at these homelands one more time, and let's think about that. And we look at the Hispano homeland in the center there, and realizing that we're looking at a very early settlement and very much isolation. Archaic folk culture, we're talking about a group of people who, we take this premise, were isolated, geographically isolated. And consequently, they, like the English in the Appalachians, the French in Canada, and perhaps even more so in Louisiana, the Hispanos in New Mexico were impacted from the outside. So there was very little change taking place in their culture. Even while the popular culture, Latino folk culture or popular culture, was emerging along the borderlands, these folks remained fairly isolated. And so when we compare it to those other homelands, we can see the size of the arrows in Nostrand's book, the inputs from outside, and certainly through 1900, the arrows very small. Outside influences working to modify the culture were very, very limited. So as a distinctive subculture, let's remember they came earlier, and with exceptions, more directly from Spain to the borderlands than either the Tejanos or the Californios. After initial colonization, the Hispanos were isolated from outside contact, and their numbers grew to the point that from the Rio Grande they moved over onto the Pecos in the late 1700s and early 1800s. and that Archaic folk culture evolved and then persisted. Remember that the markers, one of the best ones is language. We looked at this quote last week. I want to come back to it again from the researcher Espinoza. I believe there is no modern Spanish dialect, either in Spain or America, that can surpass the New Mexican in archaic words, expressions, constructions, and sounds. The distinctive Hispano surnames that are much more common in the Hispano Homeland and other Latino areas in North America. Things like folk plays and songs as well. So that period of isolation in that region allowed this culture to become solidified with very little change, to become very consistent throughout all the people who were living in that area. Later Anglo intrusions, the biggest one would be the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad. Its impact was for diffusion into the region. Certainly towns like Las Vegas, where the railroad went through, had a greater impact. But places like San Miguel, which were bypassed by it, were less impacted. In fact, it really cemented Las Vegas as the regional center for the area. The Anglo-centric economy that emerged in Las Vegas did provide jobs for the men in El Cerrito who would go in and work sometimes for days, weeks, or months even. They would only return home periodically. So we see that the little villages really weren't terribly impacted, particularly the women and children who left much less. In the early 1900s, though, this land was adjudicated by the United States government, and we're going to talk about the land resources that the people lost today. The uplands were adjudicated through the homestead process. The other land they were allowed to keep, but there were some problems with taxes and that sort of thing. Finally, we need to realize that the men, when they came back into the village, did bring some outside characteristics, but by and large, the culture was minimally impacted. The result of the men working outside of the village, though, was that the village became more and more dependent upon cash economy from outside, and that allowed them to lose interest in the agricultural infrastructure. So the irrigation ditch, the orchards, and the fields often fell into disrepair. It just didn't make sense to go out and work so hard to maintain the agricultural infrastructure when you didn't need it for money. Money was coming from outside. So we can see people who had very early on adjusted from the Spanish, from the Iberian Peninsula in Spain, a Mediterranean climate, a dry climate, things like irrigation and whatnot were fundamental there as here. We look at these slides. These are from 1938-39, and we'll talk more about the water resource in a bit. But we see that the dam across the river constructed to back up water. The water then travels along the irrigation ditch. It stays at a higher elevation, comes into the village, and then the ditches are opened up, and the water runs by gravity down to the fields, and then ultimately into the river. This part of the resource base fared a little bit better, but the upland resource base, the grazing land, was really allowed to deteriorate. We also want to talk about the landscape impress, and if we take a look at these photos, we see really what the village looked like. You'll notice a couple of things here. If you look at the village photo on the left, you'll see that a number of the buildings, particularly in the center and to the right, still have the original traditional flat roofs. Remember, people would go up into the high ridges and the higher elevations, harvest long pine poles, bring them back, lay them over the adobe walls, and that was the foundation for the roof. When the railroad came, it's important for us to keep in mind that really reduced the barriers to the diffusion of the tin roofs, and a sloped tin roof kept the rain out. It made it so that heavy snowfalls didn't endanger the safety of the roof or collapse. We can also take a look, we'll talk more about this in a minute, but most of what you see there, except for the tin roofs, is really locally available. Rock, mud, sticks, very much a sense of impressing that landscape and making home out of it. The people had a sense of place and identity. We begin with the church, because that was sort of the center. You need to remember these were very devout Catholics, and they really believed that the church was their avenue to escape a long period of terrorizing existence in hell. So staying right with the church was important. The church was a sign of pride. Here we see the local villagers in the late 1930s in probably their best attire. They're at the church, very proud of the church that they maintain. In the lower right, we see the sense of family. Families were big, families were poor, but they provided the comfort of a family, the security of a family, the reliability and trustworthiness of a family. And then we look at the picture on the left there, and we see a person doing a very common chore everywhere in the United States up until recently, and that is hanging their clothing out to dry. But as we take a look at that, we see it's a very frivolous, non-frivolous, a very stark landscape, adobe buildings. The clothing is very plain. There's not a lot of luxury going on, but this is where they live. So that was the magic place. That was the happiness. That was the quality of life reward, was to be part of this community where things were reliable and predictable. Maybe hard, yes, maybe difficult, but reliable. The other markers that we've talked about too, the Santos and the churches being somewhat regionally unique. In the lower right, the penitentes, which you've read about in Nostrand's book, a secret order of men who felt that by enduring pain in this lifetime in some sort of a religious perceived purpose would somehow make them better people and facilitate their travel to eternal bliss in heaven. We also see a picture of an horno. That is an oven made by sun-dried brick, and in just a little bit we'll take a picture of that horno, an horno that was built more recently. We can think about the sectors of the economy in these villages. You had the upland grazing. That was held in common. The land grant issued all the upland grazing land to the village as a whole. When the people first moved into the village, it's important to remember that the uplands had been maintained by natural fire frequencies. They were a mix of very productive grasses for grazing, and the carrying capacity of the upland was extremely high. Fire suppression and overgrazing resulted in a substantial deterioration of that productivity over time. They also had their irrigated plots, and those weren't held in common, but they were held individually. They became family lands of sort. And they were passed from generation to generation through the family in a very informal sense. It wasn't like they went down to the courthouse and registered this, that a certain son was now going to be farming this land. It was an informal and kind of generally agreed upon arrangement. The home sites were also held individually. Families owned that. The home site was the home, the center. Oftentimes, generation after generation lived in the home site. It was the most valuable thing, I think, that people felt they believed. To allow loss of the home site would be absolutely the most terrible thing that could happen. And no family member wanted to be identified with losing the home site. That helps explain in part why, during the Depression and the difficult years in El Cerrito, the families there were very unwilling to participate in federal programs that would loan money to the farmers to help them get through difficult times, because the federal government insisted that the loans be secured by a lien against the homestead property, and not a single person in El Cerrito wanted to be known in their family as the family member who lost the home site, made them homeless. Then remember, so we had the upland grazing, the irrigated plots, the home sites, and then the outside cash employment that people earned. Men primarily would go out. Before the railroad, they were agricultural workers. In some cases, they worked for wealthier villages, helping to herd the cattle, and were usually paid in kind of some sort, maybe a lamb or some meat or some other things. Cash was very, very scarce, but that would help to supplement the income. Later, we get agricultural opportunities at more of a regional base, going out and working in the commercial agriculture that evolved. Some people even went as far as Colorado to work in the cantaloupe agricultural sector. People were out earning money, both local and regional. With the railroad, then the jobs really began to open up. During the construction phase, a person in El Cerrito, or anyone in the Hispano Homeland for that matter, could probably make more money in a week or two by cutting down juniper, it was called cedar trees, and carving them into railroad ties. They could make more money doing that in a short period of time than an entire year of perhaps taking care of animals grazing on the mesa. We need to realize, though, as the railroad became established, there were also jobs on the railroad. Not very many Hispanos really probably took those jobs, but the town's economy grew. And so there were a number of multiplier jobs, people working in restaurants, barber shops, tailors, sewing clothes, people providing services. So there was kind of a general abundance of jobs and kind of a good, wealthy time. That money flowed back into the village and helped people meet their needs. And remember, this is what tempted them to lose sight of the value of their local resource base. So So we take a look at the Pecos corridor, which I personally am most interested in this entire Hispano homeland, because remember, the people went to the Pecos and isolated themselves along that river corridor just prior to the opening up by Mexico to Anglos of the what would be the New Mexico region. About 1820, 25, we began to see Anglos coming in the Rio Grande, but less activity along the Pecos. Remember, there were just not those economic or cultural pull factors to pull people there. I also set up another map because I want you to be able to look at the regional phenomenon, and we're in pretty barren space. We see the Pecos comes cascading down out of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains right at about where Interstate Highway 25 wraps around that mountain range. It flows out onto the Great Plains and Basin Range, and that's where that massive flow over long periods of time carved out these little tiny valleys. We're going to move along those valleys. We hinted at this last time, but I want to spend more time now that you've done additional reading. We're going to start at Las Vegas, then we're going to travel down the road through some small towns, Villanueva being the real next stop we'll take, and then off to El Cerrito. So our drive is going to be, as you can see from the purple dots, Las Vegas. We'll go up to Rivera and then cut across down New Mexico Highway 3 South, go to Villanueva, and then ultimately to El Cerrito. Las Vegas has the cultural imprint of both the early Spanish settlers into the region and then also the Anglos. On the left, you'll see this is a main road that leads into the plaza. This is a road that wagon trains were taking from the early 1800s coming into New Mexico, bringing in manufactured goods from the United States to trade for leather goods and silver and saddles and things that were coming up from Mexico. Essentially, these buildings have changed very little. They would have had flat roofs originally, and they would have not had the cement-enhanced stucco placed on them. As the town grew, and this became not just a trail for wagons, but a road ultimately for cars and additional traffic, problems with cars driving by when the streets were wet, splashing mud on the buildings, causing them to deteriorate became a problem. And so most people did resort to putting a stucco or cement plaster to protect the structures. We see the paint colors very representative of what we would expect in a Latino culture. Up in the upper right, we're standing on the plaza where the wagon trains used to come in and circle up. We're looking at the Plaza Hotel. This is an Anglo construction. It was something that was built when the railroad came in order to accommodate Anglos with money. The whole plaza became much more of an Anglo center of business. Right below the hotel picture is a photo of another building next door to it, the Ilfeld warehouse. These were Jewish merchants. There were a number of Jewish merchants in the region, and they were buying, selling wool and selling dry goods to the local people. So ironically, while this was a town in the Hispano homeland, it was really the Anglos that controlled the economic power and influence. The lower center one is looking back across the plaza, and to some degree we still see some architectural aspects that are reflective of Spanish culture. But as the city grew, because the plaza was on the old tiny core that was originally settled, we get outside of that core and we lose the imprint of those first settlers. We take a look at the main drag, and here we see the popular culture landscape that we'd find anywhere else in the United States. That popular culture landscape is there through diffusion. The diffusion of these commercial enterprises, Pizza Hut and Dairy Queen and Safeway, locating there to capture a potential share of the threshold population's market generation potential. So we do have parts of the old town, and you know this is typical in the regions. Albuquerque has its old town, that remnant of what was there, but yet the outskirts of Albuquerque are very much an urban sprawl modern community. Very much the same for Santa Fe. Santa Fe has worked hard in the new development areas to try to maintain sort of a Spanish appearance in the landscape, but they've only been fairly successful. So we have remnants of the old community in Las Vegas, and they're being treasured and saved and seen as potentially profitable for tourism, that sort of thing. But the town in general is pretty much a typical town for the region. Looking into the plaza, it's a social area of events. Festivals are held here. Ironically, the biggest festival in this town is held on July 4th, which I wouldn't think is necessarily a Hispano holiday to celebrate. But the plaza is blocked off from traffic, and food carts and music is there, bands and events. that are taking place. This is the center of it. Today, the role of the plaza is just simply kind of a place where people drive through town, except on Friday and Saturday evenings when a large constituent of young people who've probably spent most all their money on lowriders begin to drag the main street and circle the plaza up and down as they come up through town, using their hydraulics to bump their cars and turning their subwoofers or whatever those are called up extremely loud. So we see some elements of more modern popular culture, Chicano culture here today, much more than we actually see the old Hispano culture here. Driving down along the road, every town has maintained its church. This is the little village of San Miguel de Vado, and this was established in 1794. This was the center of the community along the Pecos. This large church was built. The walls at the lower part are about 3 feet tall, and I also include a picture looking inside the church. Really well maintained. Not much in the way of social functions operate there today outside the church. The church has a community center. There's a small convenience store, but the church has lost its viability, and yet San Miguel de Vado was the entry point from the United States into Mexico during the Mexican era, and the customs house was situated there, and before one could cross the river, they had to have their inventories checked and pay their taxes. Along the road, there are a number of other little towns. Every place has the capacity to build a small dam to begin to raise water and irrigation ditch to irrigate fields. We see little towns popping up. They're kind of a mix in essence. This town, this little building here, the Bustamante Grocery, certainly inside there's Twinkies and Doritos and popular culture things, as well as dried red chili, maybe some frozen green chili. But in a sense, we look at this and it almost looks like a place that's sort of been left passed by time. You take a look at the gas pumps, and ironically, these gas pumps at the time this picture were taken were still operating. They're still being filled by the openings that you see in the ground. The hoses are in good order. Just a totally amazing sort of phenomenon. Here we're getting further and further away from the popular culture. Continue on the road, and again, I want to point out, even though we see impoverished communities, people living in pretty rundown housing, a lot of not very good mobile home, portable housing being brought into the area, but the church is the center of pride. That's the town's real focus. They point to that church and say, we as a community have maintained this. The church is the center of the communities, and those communities then make up the HIspano Homeland. The picture on the upper left had been a small store. It's important to understand that, after 1945, 41 actually, population began to deteriorate, and for a while the region was substantially unpopulated. Without a customer base, many small stores went out of business. So this represents a landscape of that. In Villanueva, the last town we really go to before we reach El Cerrito, we're pretty far away from most popular culture. Yes, there's a post office there, although I'm sure the U.S. Postal Service is going to close that one down. It's not being profitable. There's a convenience store. There are a few little government services. There's a state park nearby. But it's primarily a small, quiet village where people just go about living their lives. Some people are artists. Some people still try to do farming. A lot of people are what we would call entrepreneurs. They're always looking for some small, creative way to be able to make a buck here or there. Maybe doing a little construction, maybe selling some rock off their property, that sort of thing. I want to remind you, too, I mentioned this in an earlier lecture, but I think we're really ready to take a look at it now. In the lower right, we see an adobe structure right on the edge of Villanueva. What it is, it's an enclosed compound. I've showed this picture so you can look through the door into the courtyard. When the first settlers were coming in here, they were concerned about indigenous Native Americans who might not be so welcome to be losing their land and resources and their way of life. And so these interior courtyard adobes were built. The livestock was brought into the center at night. The doors were closed, and kind of as a security function. As recently as 30 or 40 years ago, there was still a number of these around, but the process of weathering and deterioration has taken over, and I personally only know of several of these left anywhere in the area. They've just been allowed to deteriorate. It'd really be nice if someone could find a way to purchase this and restore it and preserve it. Well, as we head on down to El Cerrito, we are on New Mexico Highway 3 South. And the upper left is the exit to El Cerrito, which I pointed out to you before. It's a dirt road. Most of the time there are no signs there. Periodically the county or the state will put up a sign saying El Cerrito and a sign with the road number. But the locals are often soon up there tearing those down because they don't want people coming to the village. And particularly as projects like this one and especially the publishing of Dick's books brings more notoriety to the village, more and more people decide they want to go and check it out. The picture on the right really shows you the upland mesa grazing resource base in the economy today. Realize that when the Europeans first came here, that was a pure grassland, mixed grasses, tall and short grasses, very high nutritional characteristics for raising cattle, and they were just lush and abundant. But over time, with the suppression of fires, we began to see the junipers and the pinon and other thorny species moving up onto the mesa. Prior to Europeans, the fires would remove those, so it was constantly a battle between fires of these species moving back up onto the mesa and then the fires sanitizing and returning the mesa back to its grassy, productive nature. Also, heavy grazing took place. Remember that the land was held in common, and so there was no incentive for any individual herdsperson to only graze in a limited way because all your other neighbors were going to let their animals eat everything that was out there. So the entire disregard for the sustainability of the ecosystem evolved, and those animals continued to overeat the grasses that were good for producing beef on cattle and leaving the things grow that weren't good to eat. And so pretty soon the landscape was pretty much dominated by the kinds of grasses that really weren't good for grazing at all. Today it takes a lot of land if you're totally grazing animals for them to find enough to eat. Most people supplement their grazing with hay in order to ensure that. So this is that first resource base, the upland grazing commons, that when the United States took this land over, at some point it was adjudicated and a federal judge told the people of El Cerrito, if you want that land, you must go up and claim your quarter section, your 140 acres, live on it 5 years, improve it, and then you can have clear title. Some people did, a lot of people didn't. It was away from the village, and these are village-oriented people who they and their families have lived in villages for generations. The amount of land that you could get in the homesteading wasn't really that much, and given the reduced nature of the productivity of the grazing area, made it less desirable as well. But some people did go get that land. As we wind around and turn one last corner along the canyon, we pop in and take a look at El Cerrito, the village. And I guess when you look at it at first, maybe you're stunned with all the tin roofs which stand out, realizing that that is the result of diffusion beginning in the late 1800s when the railway made the tin roofs functionally available at a reasonable cost. Today people just go to the building supply center and get those. But you also see the structure of the buildings. They're all low, they're very consistent with the adobe sun-dried mud brick construction. You can't build those very high because the bricks are not very structurally sound. As you build up, you increase the weight on those and the walls will collapse. The village is laid out along a upper terrace, the second terrace in the village, which makes it high enough that except in extreme conditions, they won't have flooding when the Pecos leaves its banks due to phenomenal precipitation events. If you look around the village on this side, you'll see the fields. Those are the lower elevation fields, and we'll be taking a look at the long lots and the irrigation in a second. The water was backed up from the dam a mile or so upstream, brought along the edge of the river in irrigation ditches, becoming increasingly higher above the water level of the river. By the time it enters into the village, it's probably about 15 or 18 feet above the river level. The irrigation ditch winds around behind the back of the village and then snakes around and comes along the edge of the irrigated land. So all one needs to do is really go out and knock a hole in the irrigation ditch. The water will flood into your fields. The key is then to go back and shut that off after you've irrigated your fields, because if one person is pulling water out of the irrigation ditch, it reduces the availability of water for other people on down the irrigation ditch system. I also want to point out to you too, you look at the mesas around, those are hard bedrock. And the canyon and the valley floor of the Pecos are actually deeper than the soil level that you would see in the fields. The canyon is deeper, and the canyon is filled with sedimentary material with soil on top of it. So what's below, if you were to dig down in those fields a few feet, you'd begin to run into the river cobbles that are deposited by the river in ancient times. And why this is going to be important is that the groundwater that we'll find coming from the well in the village is pulling water out of those deposits, and it's actually recharged by the river. While the state of New Mexico makes a distinction between running river water and groundwater, in the case of El Cerrito, they're the same source. They're just extracted at two different places. Here's a picture of the village in the 1930s. You've seen that before, but I want to bring it back up and talk a little bit about what we see. By the late 1930s, most people had put tin roofs on their buildings. It's our speculation that the church and the school, being public buildings, were the first one to get tin roofs because that could draw assets from lots of people. But over time, individuals began to put the tin roofs on their own buildings. You'll see several buildings, one in the forefront and then one directly behind it and up, that still have their flat roofs. Today, there are no flat roof structures still in El Cerrito. The tin roofs have been put on about all the buildings, and some of the buildings are in much more state of disrepair now than they were in the 1930s due to abandonment. We come back and look at this some 50 or 60 years later, and the formation of the city, the buildings and the structures are still very similar. You'll see a lot of similar lines. In the upper left corner, you'll see the distinct angles of the line of the house there. Those were there at that time. The church is the same. Many of the little buildings are here. And if I go to the next slide, I've sort of identified by color. The yellow ring shows you the structure, how it looked in the 1930s, and then again how it looked in the late 1980s. The red structure shows the church. We can take a look at the blue line, and we can see the dormer window on that roof. It's still very evident. And what we do see is that the house in the green circle, by the 1980s, someone had added a tin roof to it, but then it had been largely abandoned. So very little change, and the reason for that change, remember, is barriers to diffusion. One change that I noticed is that there are a lot more trees. When the black and white picture was taken, there were about 140 people living in that village. That's a lot of folks, a lot of foot traffic, and a lot of need for small kindling to start wood fires, because that was the fuel by which people cooked and heated. So anything that grew was vulnerable to being pulled up and burned or used for some other purpose. As people depopulated, of course, we began to get the return of the arborescent tree-type vegetation. I want to show you some pictures around the village a little bit, and we may, on our last gathering when we come here to campus, try to take a walk around. I've been trying to work on that. Robin is confident I can do it. I'm not at all confident, but I think with her help we probably could. In the upper left hand, we see a building that's been substantially redone. We're looking at a structure here in which the old adobe is on the back side, the new portion was built, and it's a very nice, luxurious place, an indoor toilet, boy is that nice, a shower, a washing machine, a bathtub, and if you go to just the opposite corner down below where you see the big white couch, that's what it looks inside. And the wall on the left, the white framed painted window, that was the outside wall of the old adobe, and the new structure was just added onto it with the roof put over it. If you go up to the top center, here we begin to see diffusion of some modern technologies. This is the adobe of John Burns, and up above you see a converted freezer with two black tanks in there. That's the water heater. The tanks are painted black in order to absorb maximum amount of shortwave radiation or visible light from the sun, producing heat, and that's the sole method of heating water in that home. And so when the sun shines, it's not a problem at all. But in days when it gets rainy, I've been out there, and after 2 or 3 days of rain, there just isn't much hot water. And we would go out there and work, and every 3 or 4 days want to go to town for a beer, some good food or something. And we felt compelled to shower, since we were usually pretty biologically active by that time. And so with a little water, you get in, you run the water for about 10 seconds, you get wet, you soap up then, and then you run the water another 10 seconds, and that better be good, because that's all you're going to get. If you move to the right of that, you will see a winter greenhouse that has been built in El Cerrito. The north side is facing away from us, and it's heavily insulated to protect against the chilling effects of the north wind. We're looking at the south side to get solar gain, but because the winters are long and cold here, there's also kerosene heating that takes place in there. Over to your left in the center, is the other side of the house with the solar water heater. And here we see that that's had an addition with glazing, clear windows on the south side in order to get solar gain. Produces heat at the lowest level of the house. The heat rises by convection. When it gets to the top of the house, you'll notice a small solar panel. That generates electricity to run a fan to draw the warm air back down to the lower portions of the house. And then right next to that, you'll see some gentlemen standing in the kitchen there. That's in the old part of the adobe we were looking at. Down below, we see the new part. If you look at that closely, the picture's not real good. You'll see the vigas and what holding up the roof, or at one time supported that roof. And you can really see the difference, what the old type housing looked like. The lower left-hand picture is a photo of some other people's house that lived there. It's not really at all traditionally tied to the Hispano Homeland architecture. These folks built a hole into the wall, supported the beams across coming out, and then made a roof into that. So it uses some of the technologies of the Vigas, but it's a very different type building. Out there, people come up with all kinds of ideas about what they're doing. The El Cerrito Church, I want to show that to you. I come back to the picture in the upper right, the black and white picture, a proud community. That's their church. A priest really was never in residence there. Maybe they could get a priest to come from Villanueva for a marriage or a wedding ceremony or something like that. But they do open the church up and go in and pray and have some kind of non-mass oriented type services. We look at it today down below, and you can see how well it has been maintained. Over those years, the walls have been replastered, the wood's been maintained. People are very proud of it. And you look inside that little church, little tiny mud church in the middle of nowhere on the Pecos River, and you see it's really a beautiful sort of place. People have their santos, their religious items. You'll notice a wood-burning stove in the left up front to kind of heat it in the winter. And it's a special place. It's their spiritual core for that village. It's really their homeland headquarters. You'll notice in the old black and white picture, there's a cross there and a few tombstones, but you know more people died than there was land to bury them. And so today, if you look at the lower left-hand picture, you'll see that the new cemetery was opened many years ago up on the mesa. And I wanted to put that in there just to sort of show some of the characteristics that are common in Latino cemeteries throughout the Southwest, and that is the grave decoration. The plastic flowers and whatnot. Several families in the village have been competing for the best grave sites for their family. One of them has green astroturf as accoutrement to say our family has arrived. The river itself is the essential element of resource to survive. Without the water, nothing else happens. The type climate here, there's too little regular rainfall and crops wouldn't be reliable. And so we can see again that the dam backs up the water, is siphoned off in the back of that picture into an irrigation ditch, and then it begins to gain elevation above the river as the river runs down the stream. The river comes down, if you look at the lower left side of the black and white map, you'll see where the dam is, and it shows the irrigation ditch coming down to the river. The village sets up on a terrace to help it be protected from irrigation. And then we see really kind of underneath where I wrote irrigated land and drew the arrows, you'll see that El Cerrito is labeled on there. And what that is, and I'll show you pictures in a minute, is a small core of hard rock. As the Pecos cut down, and if you look at the air photos, you'll see that it hasn't really been winding too much till it gets to this point. It encountered some very durable rock that resisted the erosional factors, caused it to begin to meander, and so the whole circular valley was cut out as the river meandered back and forth because it was held up by this erosion core that we'll take a look at, the actual little hill. You can go from the map down, you can look at the home plots, and you can sort of see the structure of the town and the three main streets that are there. Then the irrigated plots, and remember those are all lower elevation than the irrigation ditch. The water is siphoned off, and then it returns back to the river as the river snakes through there. You might also notice too on the black and white map, you'll see the sign for the cemetery. That's where the new cemetery was moved that we just took a look at. So we see the upland grazing very heavily dominated by woody species. The productivity is very low. The irrigated land, we see a lot of it still being used, but not to any great productivity. Here is the Cerrito, the little hill. I've got two shots of it. We're taking a look at. That's really the feature, the hard rock that caused the river to change its course and meander through there. There's a similar phenomenon here in central Texas. If any of you have been out to Devil's Backbone on Highway 32, just west of Wimberley, the Guadalupe and the Blanco rivers were almost about ready to merge, coming from West Texas. As they hit the very hard rock that makes up the Devil's Backbone, the rivers were split and hence go in two different directions. If that rock had not been there, the two rivers, the Blanco and the Guadalupe, would have joined and have flowed through San Marcos. So here's a case where obstructing that flow really did help with creating a valley for irrigated farming. The irrigation water was essential drinking water until the 1940s. We see young people getting their buckets of water. They drank that water, they cooked with it, they bathed with it. That was the water source. A lot of sickness back then, drinking the water, a lot of bacteria made it problematic. In the 1940s, finally a well was dug. And I also have some gentlemen working on a piece of equipment here. This is how remote and rugged it was. Back then, you had to fix it. There were no fix-it people that came out. If you had something break, you needed to get together and fix it with what was locally available. Here we see again, taking you from the dam, the river, people drawing water out of it. And then the big picture, we can see the irrigation ditch. They've made openings or breaches in it, and so the water then runs down the rows between the furrows of the crops. And that's how stuff was watered. That was necessary in order to yield the crops and then feed the family. Here are some additional kinds of shots to help you understand how that long lot process worked. In the upper left, we have three astute geographer scientist types looking down the irrigation ditch, acknowledging, yes, indeed, there's water in that ditch. We're standing up on the ditch, and the picture to the right, the water runs down those furrows the same as it did for generations in order to water the crops. As the water comes through the town, you'll notice in the lower left, people have been somewhat creative. Rick Quintana has built this little feature where he draws some irrigated water off, and he's put together this stone feature that's quite nice, and water runs down into his fields. What we see growing in these pictures on the right, the green stuff, is actually alfalfa. There's not much crop growing down there now, corn, beans, that sort of thing. They're mostly growing alfalfa to feed their animals. During the 1930s, when people were trying to make a living here, they were growing corn and beans and squash and some of the traditional foods that we would have expected. Well, here is the water tower, built in 1949. If you've been to the village and virtual space, which as I recall you are now, you can turn around and look at that water tower. The well is a little bit lower in the village, but water is being drawn from the alluvial deposits, the rocks below the surface that are supporting river flow both in and out of the channel. The problem is that the community was based on using outhouses for sanitation. And the deposits made in the outhouse would naturally percolate down, and over time, and with enough rain or water, we might introduce bacteria into the water supply. So there were some potential problems with that as well. Today, the state of New Mexico has been making changes. They have had water entities come in and meter the water, and they've also put a chlorination device on their water so it's now safer to drink. But the people aren't necessarily glad about the metering of the water, as the state is trying to find ways to take water away from them. These people had hard times. They had push factors. They didn't have good jobs. They didn't have good money. Time was hard. They couldn't go to the doctor when they needed to. They lived a really harsh life. They had all the pull factors one would expect to develop, causing them to want to migrate. But they had a tenacity to stay there. That's where their family was. That's where the landscape made sense. That's where the economy made sense. That's where life was at least predictable, even though it was rough. And so many push factors were evolving, but people had nowhere to go, few pull factors. This is what held them there, that sense of family. And so we see that sense of community really building. Before I move to the modern time, I also want to come and point out the schoolhouse, because that's of particular importance to us. This is how the schoolhouse looked in 1939. The school quit being held there in the early 1950s. Because of a lack of students. Finally, the schoolhouse was converted to living quarters and hay storage. It burned in about 1958, and it pretty much disintegrated. We'll come back to that in just a moment. Now, Village of El Cerrito, remember, the people were hanging on tenaciously to village life because there were no other opportunities for them, and that was at least secure, even though difficult. So that the attack on Pearl Harbor really energized the U.S. economy and began to provide economic opportunities in the region. Particularly the steel industry in Pueblo, Colorado, offered many, many jobs, and over the next 15 or 20 years, the bulk of the people in El Cerrito moved out, many to Pueblo, Colorado, and that really led to the great outmigration of people in El Cerrito, and it would never return to those levels of population since. In more recent times, we've come back, and I and colleagues, Dick Nostrand, you'll see there another colleague of ours, Michael Painter, have reconstructed the schoolhouse. When we started doing that, there was nothing there but just simply the foundation. So we made adobe bricks. We tried to make it architecturally as identical as we could to the original building. You see on the right the new building and the low building below it. We're going to use it as for educational purposes. So you'll see inside we left what's called a truth window. We deliberately did not plaster an interior part of the wall so people could go out and see what the wall construction looks like from adobe. Lots of volunteers came out over that time, and many of them camped. We allowed a few of them to stay in the house, but many of them were just too raunchy and out of hand, so we made them sleep outdoors. One of the projects the group took on several years ago was to build an Orno, one of the markers, one of the cultural markers of the Hispano Homeland. In the upper left is a picture of El Cerrito woman in the late 1930s using the Orno to bake bread. The other pictures show the process of people beginning to build the Orno. Because it was raining, we put a tent up, but it's actually workable. And one of our group has gone out there, built a fire, and done some cooking in the Orno. Local building materials are what are used just about everywhere around there, and we tried to do that as much as possible, although we did use plywood and manufactured windows and a number of other things that helped. The village is characterized by landscapes of natural products and then landscapes of trash and junk. Being in a canyon and gravity causes trash to run downhill, the only way anything ever gets out of this village is if it's absolutely thrown out, hauled away to someplace else. Doesn't happen very often. So if you look at these pictures, you'll see old cars and scrap metal and old springs from mattresses and that sort of thing. Looking around the village a little more, you'll see a bicycle in the upper right-hand corner. That was one of our volunteers that came out and brought his bicycle. He was a bicycle enthusiast. The house in the front that you see at the top is where we stayed at Josie de Vaca's. The area on the left is the modern side with the Saltillo tile floors and the indoor bathroom and all those facilities. The part on the right is much more the way it was. But I just show you some of these pictures so you can see how things accumulate in the village and don't ever seem to go away. It's quite a repository of old cars, old trucks, old farm equipment, old structures. Most of the people that live there today are elderly, many on fixed incomes, or else they're semi-elderly. When I say elderly, I'm thinking of people a lot older than me. There's a whole group of people my age, and I didn't quite think I was being so elderly, but I guess I need to rethink that one. And they're probably just living out their last years there too, trying to make a living of some kind.